Good evening to all of you here in the room and to all of those who have joined us online. The weather is foul here in Oxford, so I'm glad to see that we still have a very significant audience, and it's an audience that is exponentially larger online. And I'm saying that because today's event is an event I'm particularly happy that we can host here at the Oxford Martin School. We have a distinguished panel of scholars and practitioners on a topic which is absolutely central to not just to the Oxford Martin program on African governance. And over the last few months, we've already had the opportunity to hold related events, but arguably one of the most important dynamics in trying to understand development in sub-Saharan Africa, but also across the global South. And that's why the topic of today's event is financial and economic crime in the global South. Illicit financial activities undercut economic growth across global South countries and hinder development efforts. Today's event will critically examine whether the current global financial regulatory framework is best suited to effectively combat financial and economic crime across the global South. We will discuss recent trends in financial and economic crime, the evolving global standards, as well as their implementation challenges, and the unintended consequences of implementing those global standards across specific developing countries, across very different contexts for which those standards were first created. As I said, our speakers have a rare accumulated experience in this field. They have many achievements to their names, and I'll present them in turn when I'll pass on the word to them. But most importantly, they have recently jointly established the Global South Dialogue on Economic Crimes Network, which is an interdisciplinary platform for advancing dialogue, research, and capacity on economic and financial crimes. The network's mission is to inform, influence, and improve researchers and stakeholders' involvement in deliberations to curb illicit financial activities. And I've had the pleasure of participating in a couple of very high-profile events that they've organized online during the COVID era. And I was very, very happy to see just the different types of expertise that you pull together. I would assume professional communities and scholarly communities that are not necessarily in direct contact with each other prior to your creating this venue. So I'd like to say that I have great expectations for the network, but that sounds very aspirational, whereas the network, I think, is already fulfilling that role, connecting lots of different expertise, and for those of us who are academics, also creating conversations which tend to be very isolated at the disciplinary level, conversations between economists, lawyers, AML experts, political scientists, I dare say, and others who are normally not part of an integrated conversation. So I'm sure that you'll be referring to the network, both to what has already been accomplished, but also in terms of the sort of foreseeable future. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joy Malala, who's assistant professor at the University of Warwick. Dr. Malala has a special interest in researching financial regulation and supervision, the legal accountability of regulators, and corporate governance. And she will not only be making the first remarks in this panel, but she's also standing in for Dr. Nkechi Azinge Igberi, who is meant to be our second speaker. Unfortunately, Dr. Azinge Igberi is airborne right now. Her flight was late, so she didn't make it to Nigeria on time to participate in our panel. So Joy, please, if you could start with the comments, both yours and Nkeshi's. And just to say that we're aiming at relatively short presentations. Each of the speakers will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes so that we can have a conversation. I know there's significant expertise online and in this room, and our speakers may also want to interact with each other at the later stage. So over to you, Joy.
Thank you, Ricardo, for this invitation, and thank you, everyone, for braving the weather to come and listen to us talk about our interests and our combined expertise in this area. We are part of, as he's mentioned, the Global South Dialogue on Economic Crime, which came about as a result of realizing that there was a lacuna in the discussions on money laundering and financial regulation, particularly as it pertains to Global South countries. And a lot of money laundering occurs and is impacts developing countries and what we are calling Global South countries, where a lot of illicit flows, the flows come out of developing countries and are invested in developed countries. And so the discussion is always centered around implementation of global standards. And we sort of try to ask, what are these global standards, if they are unequally applied, if they are creatively applied, and if they are imposed without due reference to Global South contexts. So the network came about 2 years ago. However, we had been thinking about it for a couple of years in our research, in our various research, where we intersect from banking regulation to money laundering to tax and the political economy. So it's a very interdisciplinary network, and we research a lot of financial crime and look for responses, not only from an academic point of view, but from research-oriented, practitioner-led responses. And so that's who we are as a network, and we hope you will continue to engage with us beyond this event. So I have the very good honor of presenting on behalf of Nkechi. As Ricardo has mentioned, she's airborne and couldn't make it. And her presentation was on the Global South perspective and the unintended consequences of imposing global standards. And her presentation was centered on 3 key points. One was on the history and implementation of anti-money laundering standards, particularly by the Financial Action Task Force, which we are calling the FATF, which is the global regulator. And the second key point is on the implications and unintended consequences. So what are the resultant impacts of imposing the FATF on countries that are not aligned with FATF itself? And then the third key point is on the reforms that she is, or she has been suggesting, right? So the first on the history and implementation is that the FATF prides itself as being a participatory ecosystem that has engaged all governments, when actually it was originated by very few countries in a developed country like Switzerland and the UK and the US, mainly G7 countries. And the policies were tailored towards those countries' already existing AML laws without due regard to its implementation globally. Yeah. So she talks about the inequity of developing countries in different stages of their development. And then the decision-making processes of these G7 countries and the deliberations that they have do not take due regard to Global South countries. So of course, it brings about challenges. And these challenges are about a crisis of legitimacy, right? So trust is eroded in their authority because these standards are unequal, yeah? And so the FATF imposes standards of compliance and their ratings. You're kicked out of a trajectory of compliance, and then you're suddenly de-risked, or you are ousted, or you're sanctioned, right? So these are the challenges that she she identifies within having global AML standards. And she brings out this idea of global South countries not having a choice but complying creatively. Yeah. So it becomes a tick box exercise that countries are afraid of being listed and therefore comply creatively without the spirit of the law, right? So we try to follow the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. And secondly, she discusses the unintended consequences, where, for instance, it brings about the issue of lawyers and their lack of, or rather, lawyers being professional enablers, which Lovina will discuss at depth, where there are conflicting national laws which are not aligned to global standards. For instance, in Nigeria, I think there's a law that requires lawyers to report any transaction over $1,000. That could be all transactions. So as you can already tell, that is not something that brings about equity in, or rather it imposes a rather strict compliance. And then she also talks about banks' due diligence requirement and the know your customer economy, where requiring citizens to offer identification becomes very challenging because citizens in global South countries do not have the same requirements, identity requirements, as they do in European countries, for instance, right? We don't have physical addresses. We rely on community references, right? We don't have paper documents, which is something that is a very administrative process, right? So it leads to a lot of exclusion, particularly when you talk about cash-based economies, informal markets, where people operate from a tacit, knowledgeable perspective. And so when you impose, for instance, digital identification as a requirement to comply to FATF, you exclude such a large population, right? She also talks about how civil society organizations are required to register or to abide by FATF standards in terrorist financing. And this is how they apply a risk-based approach, whereas in-country experience shows that there are so many overlapping regulatory requirements, which leads to overregulation, which becomes very, very expensive, and therefore does not create any incentive for global South countries to comply. So there seems to highlight a very unequal playing field. And as you know the saying that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu, which certainly happens because a lot of what this creates is a system of extraction. And so the third point she makes is on reforms, or rather solutions. And the point she's trying to make is that there's no one size fits all in applying global standards. And what is global standards really? Yeah. And she says that we need to pay due regard to in-country contexts in this application and not have a top-down approach, yeah, and rationalize how we can implement these standards, or whether we have or give more teeth to regional sort of compliance bodies, which exist, but only exist symbolically. Because the goal, as we've seen, is that the FATF has to sanction before the in-country regulatory bodies can work. And so with that, I can defer to Lovina.
Okay. My name is Lovina Otudo, and my research expertise is actually on financial regulation, especially on anti-money laundering. So for today, I want to look at what I term professional enablers in AML. And I'll be taking my context from Nigeria. Now, you may want to know what are professional enablers. Professional enablers are they could be individuals, they could be businesses, they could be organization. The main thing that rallies all of them around is their expertise. So they come with informed knowledge, with an expert knowledge in which they assist the criminals, those who actually launder criminal proceeds, they assist them to transport their funds seamlessly through the system. So I actually see them as gatekeepers. So they are gatekeepers to the financial system. They could either open the doors of criminality or they could close the door of criminality. By opening the door of criminality here, I mean they could give access for their clients to launder money through the financial system. Or if they actually want to help, they could close the door by maybe reporting and going beyond their duties to ensure that the financial system remain safe. So, how do they go about it? They go about it basically in two forms. They could either be complicit in the crime, they could either facilitate, that's maybe give information to their clients, assist their clients, or on the opposite side, they could maybe through their negligence act or not actually reporting, enable their clients still pass through money through the system. So basically what they do, they either exploit the loopholes of the system, or they try to skirt the fringes of legality. Now, you will now wonder, how do they go about it? This they could do by, for instance, establishing companies and hiding the beneficial ownership. They could also do this by failure to report. Maybe they know that their clients have skeletons in their cupboards, their clients are criminally minded or involved in criminality, they fail to report. They could also do this by assisting their clients, because normally, for instance, some of these people I call professional enablers, they could be lawyers, they could be banks, they could be mortgage advisor. So the system already has confidence in them. They see them as peoples of repute, and as such, whatsoever they try to do to aid their clients, it's seen as being genuine, when actually some of them are not. So they could also assist their clients in buying properties and advising their clients on so many other things that are illegal. We saw this clearly in the Panama cases, where the law firm of, I think, Mazak Fonseca had used over 14,000, it was a mixture of law firms, banks, incorporating companies for its clients without actually knowing the source of their clients' wealth, in which most of them were criminal in nature. We also know about the Paradise leaks. We know about the Luanda leaks, and even the Mauritius incident. So all this thing is an avenue of trying to assist their clients, either knowingly or unknowingly, in the transmission of the process of crime. So the FFTF the FATF at a point realized that behind the veil of criminality were people who aided these criminals. And these were people who were actually not regulated. So they now said, yes, we have these criminals, yes, we have this money laundering, but some of them don't even have this expertise. There are people who are assisting them to launder this process. So it was now a question of what do we do, and it was agreed by FATF that they had to be regulated. So the Financial Action Task Force now puts a duty on them to know their clients, to do proper due diligence, and also to report anything that they found as suspicious transaction. But we all know as a fact that the regulatory standards of FAT cannot be administered by FAT. It has to filter down to national jurisdictions. So, and it is not these national jurisdictions that have to adopt these regulatory standards, and they're also the one who have to implement them. As a result of this, that is what will now take me to the Nigerian experience. A country like Nigeria said, okay, we have to tick the box so that we will be able to at least get off the hook of FAT. And in so doing, they now, I think in 2002, they now enacted the Anti-Money Laundering Prevention and Prohibition Act. Originally, the act did not look at professional enablers. In as much as it had looked at designated non-financial businesses, it never looked at professional enablers. But that particular act has passed through about 3 repeals, and the current one now sort of looks at regulating both, apart from the non-financial institution, it also regulates state and designated businesses and profession in which lawyers are included. But there is a problem, because before this regulation came into place, there were other regulations in place. And Nigeria is one of the countries in which client lawyers' privilege is sacrosanct. It's protected by the Constitution, it's protected by the Evidence Act, it's protected by the Legal Practitioners Act and rules. So when you now have an act in 2002 that now says, okay, if you're a lawyer and your client is involved in criminality, and you may even ask, what is the criminality? The discretion is still left for the lawyer. So the lawyer is now faced with the scenario that it leaves his ordinary day-to-day relationship with his client to turn out to be an investigator. So if you see that your client is involved in suspicious transaction, you have to report. It puts a duty on them that they also have to know their clients by doing proper due diligence. But there have been judicial authorities. In fact, the last one, which is still subsisting, the 2015, in which it was the central bank that took the Nigerian Bar Association to court, and the court held that client lawyer's privilege is sacrosanct. You cannot change it. Any information a lawyer had in the course of his relaying his duties to his lawyer remains with the lawyer. It should not be disclosed, except it is on the agreement with the client that such should be disclosed. So when you have these conflicting decisions, it now brings problems. It is very, very easy for the lawyers to choose the latter in time, which normally should be the case. It is very, very easy for the lawyers to say, we have a judicial precedent. It has not changed. We cannot just, because we want to because we want to implement FAT standards, we have to bend. So what am I saying? There were systems in place. Those systems have not changed. Now, global standards need to be implemented. But these global standards, in a way, have no recourse that there was a system in place. Before these global standards can effectively be implemented, there should be either a repeal of the old system, which will take time, because repealing here means from amendments of the Constitution, which is the grand norm of the society in Nigeria, amendment of the Evidence Act, amendment of the rules of professional ethics, amendment of the Legal Practitioners Act, before we even talk about a law that has been put in place in 2020. So in essence, what I feel is that regulatory standards, to be effectively implemented, have to have recourse to local conditions, local circumstances. They do not just hang from the air, otherwise they will not work. Because at times, some of these politicians, I'm not saying that is the case, they themselves know these things will not work. But because we want to tick the box, it shouldn't always be about ticking the box. It should be about how effective is it? How are these collaborations going to be? Because when you look at it in the sense that the financial action came about, like she said, by the G7 at a time in which they were struggling with certain issues in their regulatory environment. They had issues of drugs, they had issues of tax evasion, they have issues of ammunition, misuse of ammunition. So they were struggling with those issues, and they originally made these laws to fit into their regulatory environment. But gradually they saw that the world was a global village. Whatsoever happens in UK could affect a country in Asia. Whatsoever happened in US could affect a country in could affect Philippines. So that there should be a consensus. But the way of bringing about this consensus was not actually there, because to me, this consensus should have been brought about by calling everybody to a round table. But currently, as we have 37 nations deciding for every other country. I know people will say, yes, we have regional bodies, but these regional bodies are like toothless bulldogs. They just bark without biting. Yes, they do make regional decisions, but are these regional decisions listened to at all? No. It is actually the key 37 nations that decide for every economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I should say we moved on from the previous speaker. Dr. Lovina Otudor has been a distinguished member of the Nigerian bar for almost 20 years. She has a PhD from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London, and was, amongst many other things, Deputy Director of the Ministry of Justice in Cross River State in Nigeria.
So just a little bit of a background before I go into what I will talk about, which is unexplained wealth. So I'm a lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Reading, and I have three main research areas that I'm particularly interested in. So the first is banking regulation, and I have a monograph in this area. So it looks at banking regulation in Africa, but particularly looks at Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. And in that book, I try to assess, it's based on my PhD, and I try to assess the effectiveness of the regulatory frameworks in these three countries. I'm also interested in bank insolvency. I recently co-edited a book with a colleague of mine at Sheffield University. It is an edited collection, but himself and myself. Him and I? Wrong English, but I think you understand what I mean. So my colleague and I edited a chapter in that book, and we just looked at, the way bank insolvency is dealt with in developing economies, generally speaking. And my third area is in the area of financial and economic crime. And particularly, I'm interested in this concept of unexplained wealth. Now, just to link it back to a couple of things that my colleagues had mentioned previously, at the Global South Dialogue on Economic Crime, our primary focus is to look at the way financial and economic crime is dealt with in developing economies. And we've had a number of events, or several events, this year and last. Our most recent event was on unexplained wealth, and so it was quite well attended. We had speakers from many different parts of the world. I think we had about 300 or 400 speakers thereabouts, if I'm not mistaken. And so the keynote speech for that conference was delivered by Professor Nicholas Ryder. He's a seasoned academic in that particular area of financial and economic crime. Now, to that end, or as a result of that, we have an edited book which is coming as a result of that conference. So it was sponsored by the Society of Legal Scholars and also the University of Reading. So it was a fully funded conference. Now, just to go into a little bit about this unexplained wealth, which is my particular area of research, I am currently writing a monograph in this area. And this concept of unexplained wealth, to put it in more simple words, is when you see somebody who is in perhaps a political position, and I'll move on to politically exposed persons, but their job title doesn't necessarily resonate with the income that they're demonstrating or displaying. And so within that concept of unexplained wealth, I focus particularly on some jurisdictions and also on this idea of politically exposed persons. So politically exposed persons could be people like judges, they could be high seasoned lawyers, people that have this kind of exposure from a high level. They could be judges as well. And the question, or one of the things that that book seeks to explore, is how do you explain a judge whose wealth is known, it's probably in the public domain, having a house in Billionaires Row? How do you make the correlation? If we know that your salary is probably 50, 60,000 pounds a year, how are you able to own, a fully furnished house in Billionaires Row, carry the latest Louis Vuitton bags, carry the latest designer products? So, what is the correlation there? And so my research looks into that particular area specifically. Now, in terms of the book, I focus on politically exposed persons. So my jurisdictions of interest are Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. And so I particularly look at the effectiveness of dealing with unexplained wealth in those regions. So if I zoom in a little bit on Nigeria, which I think Lavina had mentioned previously, the core question I'm asking there is, how does the Nigerian government, or how does the Nigerian legal framework address this concept of unexplained wealth? So you have these politicians who are supposedly politicking for the purposes of the country, but these are the same people that we know what their salary is, but they're able to send their children to schools abroad. They're able to send them to, the finest schools, and even in fact probably pay cash for their tuition fees. So the question is, what kind of activity are they really into that will enable them to be able to afford that particular lifestyle? So I look at it from the perspective of Nigeria in that instance. And again, just to tag on to what Lavina said, I don't think the challenge in Nigeria is that we don't have enough laws. I think actually we've got quite a number of laws. And in some instances, what you find is that they are continually adding more laws as a tick box exercise type of approach. And the question that I'm really looking at is, yes, we have these laws, but how effective are these laws in terms of dealing with the main issue? So moving away, the second part of what that book looks at is, how is this concept of unexplained wealth dealt with in other countries? So again, I think piggybacking on a little bit on what Joy said earlier, this, we're starting to see this pattern of wealth being taken from developing countries and then being invested, as it were, into developed countries. And so it almost seems, to a degree, if I dare say, that the developed countries are happy to take this wealth. They're happy for the wealth to be, invested, and they're not necessarily asking those questions in terms of, well, where is this wealth coming from? And, kind of explain the source of your funding. Having said that, the UK did recently enact the Economic Crime Act in 2022, I think it was March. So that's recently come into force. So hopefully we might start to see a change in the approach that has been taken. So I essentially look at this concept of unexplained wealth in my book, and those are the two prongs essentially that we look at. And I think that's pretty much it that I wanted to share with you this evening. I don't know if we can move to Lucky Star perhaps. Okay.
Just going to move to our last speaker, to Lucky Star Miandazi, who's, I think,
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Ricardo, for the introduction. And I couldn't hear the interludes because we were interrupted. But just to add on to the introduction, I'm Lucky Star Miandazi, and I work as a tax specialist for the United Nations Development Program based out of the Africa Sustainable Finance Hub in Pretoria, South Africa. And I focus on tax and the sustainable development goals, particularly an initiative known as Tax for SDGs. And I was one of the founding directors for GSDEC. Just a disclaimer here, the views and opinions I'm expressing are my own and not representative of UNDP. So my part is to talk about illicit financial flows, especially in Africa. And the first thing I'd like to say, which is also picking up from what was said during the introduction by Joy and Kechi in absentia, is illicit financial flows. How do we define it? That's how I will start. Then secondly, I'll talk about the scale and magnitude of illicit financial flows in Africa, the challenges that African countries face while trying to curb illicit financial flows. And then I'll conclude by mentioning some of the ongoing processes to try and curb illicit financial flows in Africa and suggested ways forward. I'll very much be borrowing from a webinar that we had as GSDEC last year. So first we start with illicit financial flows. And there's a paper I wrote in 2018 with a former colleague on how to, on talking about illicit financial flows, the magnitude and how to stem them in Europe and in Africa. And one of the things we wrote on that paper and found out is that you can look at the definition of illicit financial flows, which sometimes is used as the same synonym with illicit capital flight. So you can look at it from defining it from a legalistic perspective, which means that you look at the international flow of money that is illegally acquired, transferred, or used. You can look at it from a normative perspective, which tends to be the definition that is widely used, where illicit financial flows is money that is illegally earned, transferred, or utilized, but somehow also includes some legal but illegitimate practices. So, for example, commercially hiding wealth, tax avoidance and evasion also included here, criminal activities such as drug trade, human trafficking, illegal arms dealing. There's also corruption and abuse of office. The third definition of illicit financial flows is sometimes the developmental definition, which looks at illicit financial flows in terms of that accounts for their direct and indirect impact on economic and social and political stability and development in our society. And the fourth option is actually not to use the term illicit financial flows. But then, as I said, most of international organizations tend to go with a normative definition of illicit financial flows that encompasses commercial, criminal, and corrupt activities. And so in 2015, we might have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is 17 development goals that countries agreed to achieve by 2030. We're now almost 8 years into reaching 2030. So looking at this. And within these 17 goals, goal 16.4 calls for country to, by 2030, significantly reduce illicit financial flows and arms flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, and combat all forms of organized crime. So this is just to show that illicit financial flows is a topic that has been something that is at the heart of development policy discussions since 2015, but even prior to that, for it to be included within the SDGs. Then now I'll talk about the magnitude of illicit financial flows, especially in Africa. And here I want to mention that we have said that illicit financial flows is an issue of global concern. I think the presenters who've presented have presented on various things that link global south to global north to other regions. But for Africa, illicit financial flows is an issue of grave concern. And why is that? Because African economies are already struggling to mobilize resources to meet development needs. The aftermath of what we would call the CCC crisis, COVID, climate, and conflict within the continent, heightened insecurity in the Sahel region, the ongoing tightening of monetary policies around the world. They add a lot of destabilizing effects on African economies. On top of that, the war in Ukraine that has led to trade disruption, food and fuel price spikes in Africa, macroeconomic instability, rising debt, distress, security challenges, imported inflation, and a lot of other issues in the geopolitics of the world that we live in today. And so in Africa, there was a report that was done in 2020 by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. In short, we call it UNCTAD. And this report found that Africa annually loses through illicit financial flows $88.6 billion. Now, I want to contextualize this figure. This figure equates 3.7% of Africa's GDP, gross domestic product, and is close to half of the $200 billion financing gap per year that Africa needs to achieve the SDGs. It's also almost equal to what Africa gets in terms of official development assistance and FDI's flows. And so what this means is that illicit financial flows has a development cost. It's just not a number. It means that it's funding that has been taken away from funding of education, schools, infrastructure, public health, so goods and services that we need on the continent. And so let's think about that as I continue with the presentation. So now I'll talk about some of the challenges that the continent faces when trying to stem illicit financial flows. And again, here I'm borrowing from the webinar that we had last year, where we had participation from various representatives from African countries that were talking about this, and various experts on this. And number one is the lack of data at the national level. So most of the time, it is very hard for policy to be implemented and to be legislated, because there's national level statistics cannot be mentioned on illicit financial flows. So nationally, some countries in Africa have tried to say how much they lose, but it's very difficult, and not many countries have a figure of how much they lose individually. There's limited capacity, and here I always like to say that it's not to say that we do not have capacity on the continent. It's just to say that illicit financial flows is very intricate and complex area of financial crimes, and sometimes it's difficult to legislate it. There's also legislative implications where new and rising illicit financial flows, for example, on commercial ways, we have what we call base erosion and profit shifting, transfer pricing laws. In some African countries, transfer pricing units within the revenue administrations are quite new. So it's hard sometimes to investigate these types of illicit financial flows. And also lack of corporate transparency, where there's not a framework for government to regulate corporate transparency, which has been very difficult, especially when it comes to intra-company trade, which accounts for a lot of transfer pricing issues that do give rise to loopholes that can be used for illicit financial flows. Then the other issue that has been discussed in a little bit by my colleagues is the difficulty in asset recovery. And here I want to acknowledge that there has been a lot that has been done in terms of confiscating frozen assets and returning them to the countries where they belong, following standards, international standards that have been recommended, signing exchange of information documents. But there's still more that needs to be done, because most of the time, some of these assets that are recovered from the global north rarely do reach the global south. Now, I'll talk about the policy, some of the policy measures that have been taken or need to be taken, especially in African countries, to stem illicit financial flows. And I'll start with data and research, which is an area that we focus on at my place of work, UNDP, and also within GSDEC, which is to encourage research on illicit financial flows, the various forms of illicit financial flows, and what countries can do about illicit financial flows. So to bridge the information gap, which is research on data and analysis, and hopefully also collaborate with government institutions in this area, the ministries of finance, the revenue authorities, the statistical departments, the Ministry of Commerce. All this can come together in a whole of government approach towards stemming illicit financial flows. Next, I'll talk about capacity enhancement. And here it also relates to some of the work that I do, which is coordinating what we call the Tax Inspectors Without Borders initiative between UNDP and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And through TIWB, we are able to support countries when it comes to criminal tax audit investigations, for example. We're able to support countries when it comes to some of the more digital, sophisticated means and new technologies being used to fight illicit financial flows, including establishing of forensic labs at the revenue authority level. And we've had quite a successful program running in Honduras currently. And we're hoping to have more. We have pilot programs in African countries such as Kenya. We have one in Tunisia, and we're hoping to have more and more countries coming on board. Another area is improving beneficial ownership of companies, and this is towards transparency on who owns the company, who's responsible for paying taxes on the companies. And one way this can be done is through company registries at the national level. Then I'll talk about exchange of information, which can be automatic or spontaneous. This is particularly important in African countries, and it's taking seed, but hopefully it will be quickly and more rapidly implemented, because companies that operate in a country in Africa, in East Africa, let's say in Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, is also likely to be the same company operating in the SADC region, in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia. So if countries are able to exchange information on for tax purposes, particularly, this can be very helpful in terms of finding out what taxes are being paid in what jurisdiction. And this should also happen with Global North countries, where some of these companies usually have their mother headquarters and they are registered there for tax purposes. The other thing I will talk about is mandatory disclosure regimes. And this tends to be sometimes a very controversial issue. But in terms of company transparency and accountability, how are we able to penalize enablers of illicit financial flows? And this is a way of having that, to disclose where they're paying taxes and to who. Then interagency cooperation. And I think here we mean also international organizations coming together, organizations such as GSDEC coming together. I see Ricardo's hand going up, so I think my time is almost up. I'll finish with some 2 points. Then the other thing is also to look at client attorney privilege. And I think this was discussed very much by Dr. Lovina through her research, and how we can also try and stem illicit financial flows through this, but also the disclaimer that we do respect taxpayer confidentiality and we respect client attorney privileges. Then lastly, the involvement of international organization. And of course, this is a little bit of self-marketing here, but there are many international organizations, especially within the United Nations, ourselves, UNDP, we have UNCTAD, we have UN Office on Drug and Crimes, we have various other international organizations, the OECD, working in this area to support developing countries as they try to stem illicit financial flows. And I think that this issue, once it's taken seed and people are beginning to understand, our governments are beginning to understand, organizations are beginning to understand, we can work together and hopefully eliminate them, not only in African and developing countries, but also in the global north that lose out when there's any type of illicit financial flows taking place. Thank you very much. I hand back over to Professor Ricardo. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I have several questions here that I'd like to ask our panelists, but I think at this stage it's best that we open the floor to the members of the audience. We have about 35 people here and we have about 80 people online. So we're going to do a mix of questions from the audience and online questions, and then I'll throw in my questions midway if possible.
Cheers, thank you. Angus Perry, I'm a PhD researcher here at Oxford. Over the last 5 years, the US and G7 countries have really pushed corporate transparency and beneficial ownership in contrast to its previous kind of KYC, customer due diligence approach. And there was over 100 countries, including Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya, all committed to beneficial ownership. Do you think it risks repeating the same dynamics you described with previous FATF recommendations, or are you more optimistic?
Good question. Who wants to tackle that?
Marina will. One, in terms of beneficial ownership, there will always be problems. Why do I say there will always be problems? Because the regulatory environment, we have a division in terms of regulation. We have conflicting interests. While some countries believe on full disclosure, in which we are able to lift the veil of incorporation and know who owns this, there are still countries that believe that they should be hidden. So there's actually no uniformity in terms of beneficial ownership. And once that is there will always be a problem. So it's actually a hurdle or a stumbling block in the full implementation of FAT standards. And I feel part of the reason that is that way is because there was no consensus. Because we need to sit down. People need to understand why we should stop why we should not allow the transportation of criminal proceeds, because it affects everybody. These funds are used in diverse ways. They could be used in criminality, apart from ordinary criminality, they could be used in terrorist attack. We never know who will be a victim of terrorist attack. So we need to sit down, we need to have a consensus. There should be a uniformity. Without uniformity, it's very, very difficult to have that approach being successful. Thank you.
Thank you, Movini. And I think this speaks to the wider theme of your presentation about the enablers, that there's so much, and I don't mean this ironically, there's so much talent in these service providers that the sluggish pace at which regulatory innovation happens, they outpace it by just being smart and working across different jurisdictions. So without a more comprehensive approach, you're just creating new opportunities for others to game it. Yeah. There's an online question which Clara Boyer is going to read out.
Sonia asks, how do you think non-profit organizations can effectively help solve these crimes in developing states, e.g. education, gaining trust, providing practical incentives?
Joy, would you like to take that? Or the role of non-profit organizations in this space?
Lucky actually can answer this because she's quite prolific in this space, and she works for a UN organization, so she has tacit knowledge of the workings of NGOs.
I wasn't quite sure if we could still count on Lucky Star.
Right, yeah. No.
I'm still here.
You're going to...
Okay. So, and the echo's gone. I actually forgot to say that I'm an Oxonian, so I'm very disappointed. It's logging me out. I think the role of non-governmental organizations in general is to put pressure on the governments to push for transparency and accountability, but also to push for allocations when it comes to some of these funds being returned into the country, to push for allocation into healthcare, into education. So this can be done in various issues. There are various non-governmental organizations that work on budgeting and the budget process. So tax expenditure is quite important for NGOs and CSOs to influence. We have a lot of non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations such as Tax Justice Network movement in Africa and globally. We have Oxfam, we have the ActionAids that are doing a very good job of highlighting the magnitude of illicit financial flows. Research, advocacy, campaigning, and capacity building goes a long way. And as Joyce said, this used to be my former hat, running some work with some of these civil society organizations, and also working for a think tank for Europe and Africa to actually highlight the number of how illicit financial flows affects African countries and bring this to the forum when discussing international tax matters. So this is one of the ways that NGOs, CSOs can help support solving and curbing illicit financial flows. Back to you, Ricardo.
I'm just going to ask a question, maybe Folashade, this one is for you. It's slightly related, just to sort of push the boundaries here of what we mean by Global South. Oftentimes, the conversation is phrased in terms of, as I have myself earlier on in this conversation, of a rather hypocritical Global North and a Global South pushing back. But in fact, a lot of Global South governments are either ambivalent about the reform agenda or they're just not part of it. I'm thinking off the top of my head, India, China, Russia, Brazil. There are big absences from this conversation. Russia established its own de-offshoreization agenda about 10 years ago. But as we know, it was used as a political tool against people the president didn't like. We know that a large number of members of the Russian elite continued to bask in offshore games until the present time. And even in the case of Africa, we see that a lot of the great work that has been done by organizations such as the Tax Justice Network Africa, or other organizations, civil society groups, some work by African parliamentarians, but most African governments, most of the time, are not champions of this agenda. So I would like to hear you on what forms of collective action from Global South governments could be there and aren't, and why aren't they, and what could be done to push that forward.
Move this forward. I think the first thing is that these African countries must have the willpower or want this change to actually occur. A good example of this might be the Whistleblower Protection Bill in Nigeria. That bill has been before the National Assembly since 2007, and then it moved
2007.
2007. Then it moved a little bit forward in 2011, and that's where we're still at the moment. So there has to be this, dare I say, paradigm shift in that these governments must want their countries to progress in order for this change to actually take place or occur. And I think, as Lavina and I said previously, it's not that we don't have these laws. We do have them, but it's more of a tick box exercise. And I suppose it's really translating from these laws to it actually being effective and actually working in practice so that we can actually see the results of these. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think to add to what she has said, there's also the issue of lack of trust. So developing nations or global South nations, they don't really trust the developed nations because they feel that we are not really into it. There's something else. I've been in government, so I know the discussions from a privileged position, what has been happening. They are like, it's their laws. Let them implement it. So it's not, for it to be successful, we have to move it from being their laws to our laws. We have to see it as a collective effort.
So there has to be ownership. In a sense.
Yeah.
I think Lucky Star wants to add something to this.
I think I wanted to say that we do have a lot of cooperation and what we call South-South exchanges. That is something that's coming up, and it's no longer it's about co-creation. And I want to piggyback on something that was said by Dr. Joy at the beginning when she was speaking about if you're not on the table, at the table, you're on the menu. And one of the things that we've been increasingly doing is ensuring that there's an African voice, so to speak, in some of these global discussions, especially when it comes to issues that are going to affect them, so that this then helps African countries come back and implement the laws because they're not, or they were a part and were able to also articulate that well. You know, for example, when you talk about taxation of the digital economy, some African countries did not sign on to one of the big deals that was signed on by other countries, including Kenya and Nigeria, and they were very, very specific as to why they took part in the negotiating process but did not sign on to this deal. And now they're working with other African countries to try and see what are the African priorities when it comes to taxation of the digital economy vis-a-vis what's happening in the global north, so to speak. So now I think more African countries want to have this kind of exchanges. In the work that I do with tax inspectors without borders, we have African countries increasingly requesting expertise from other African countries. So for example, we have Kenya Revenue Authority providing support to Botswana Revenue Services. We have SARS, South Africa Revenue Services, providing expertise and training to Zambia, to Zimbabwe. So this kind of South-South exchanges, because of the experience also that we have within Global South countries. So, and it's a shared experience, so to speak. So now there are more solutions stemming out of the Global South on financial crime issues, particularly. Back to you.
Is there a question, please? Can you introduce yourself and?
Oh,
Sorry, you're keeping busy today,
Yes.
Clara.
Hi there, I'm Adam. I'm a master's student at the Department for International Development here. We've spoken quite a bit about stemming illicit financial flows, but I wonder what happens when the state itself is the facilitator. And I speak in particular reference to tax amnesties, which is my specific area of research with respect to Indonesia. So Indonesia held one in 2015-16, and it provided the opportunity to onshore assets kept abroad with the intention of them being taxed. But it seems to me that it was an opportunity that could be exploited for illicit financial flows, for declaring assets back into the country that were perhaps legally obtained. I wonder whether you've had any experience of conducting tax amnesties, whether you think they are an effective means of asset recovery, and whether they bear the inevitable cost of facilitating illicit financial flows.
Thank you. Excellent question. Who wants to tackle that?
I think we should get that to lunch.
Okay, hang on.
I think the pressure is on. I was hoping Dr. Lovina would take this first, or even Joy. But I think that's a very interesting research, Adam, and maybe later we could exchange emails on that, because I'm quite interested on the case of Indonesia. But so to speak, when countries are enablers, not to take the example of Indonesia, but when we're looking at tax havens and sometimes countries or low tax jurisdictions, maybe because they like to call themselves that, as enablers of illicit financial flows. I think it's also about creating sort of awareness as to the implications of some of these laws and what generally they would lead to. So what we're trying to do right now is ensure that no one is undercut. So if you have a, let's say, 0 to 9% corporate tax rate vis-a-vis your neighbor, a country that has 25% tax rate, of course, corporates are going to come into your country. But then you think that corporates are coming into your country to invest, but they're only using you as a conduit and then transferring the assets somewhere else where maybe instead of 9%, they can pay in another tax haven 0% or 1% or whatever. So everyone loses in this game. So I think when it comes to states as sort of like enablers of illicit financial flows, and I think you were asking about amnesty, I think the idea is sometimes to introduce this in order to encourage getting back some of the assets that were stolen from the state, but it can have the unintended consequence of leading to more illicit financial flows. And I think my colleagues on the panel have quite the experience, and I think also Dr. Nkechi, if Joy wants to add on something on this, is that there are sometimes laws that we can introduce thinking that as developing countries that we're copy pasting something that we've seen a developed country doing, but it has unintended consequences of creating more loopholes. So I hand over back to the panel. I think maybe Joy, if you have anything to add on that.
In her book on AML and its implication on African countries, she does touch on that, where African countries are left to comply creatively. Yeah, so in that creative compliance comes loopholes, which the state can yield for its benefit. And so she touches a lot on that. And I mean, it's somehow like shooting in the dark. Somehow you don't want to be blacklisted, but you also want to repatriate what is stolen from the country. And you know that an asset recovery mechanism doesn't always yield the results that you hope would. And state actors are also complicit in that extraction. So it's also a political issue, right? And safeguarding self-interest, not in the interest of the public, which happens everywhere. So yeah, I think creative compliance is an issue in that regard. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joy. I have a question here for Folashade about unexplained wealth, which perhaps trying to map this onto the enablers that Lovina mentioned earlier on. At least in the UK, a lot of so-called suspicious activity reports are filed by banks. They're not filed by lawyers. They tend to be filed to a much lesser extent by real estate agents, but especially by banks. And the experience in the United States seems similar. When we found out through the FinCEN files, which were leaks of suspicious activity reports filed with the Treasury Department in the US that came out last year. What was interesting is that a lot of banks seem to be mechanically filing these suspicious activity reports more as disclaimers to be seen to show something. So lots and lots of activity, very difficult to go through because there's so much of it. A lot of it is innocuous. Lawyers is the opposite. They seem to be, from this perspective, quite unregulated. If we're looking at these enablers, these facilitators that Lovina alluded to earlier, I'm not saying that because the banks are so heavily regulated, there's no problem there for reasons that we know. But the legal profession seems to be at the other end. So what sense do you make of that? Do you think it's transitional? Are we moving into a more high maintenance regulation for the legal profession? How do you see in the framework, especially of the book that you're writing, how do you position lawyers particularly?
I think lawyers are quite creative in their approach to applying the law, and also and I speak as lawyers, and in terms of interpreting the law. So I think they are, as Lavina said, they are professional enablers, and I don't know the best way to kind of say this. They do play an active role. But I think that the limelight, as it were, is starting to shine on them, and they are starting to require a bit more evidence. We have to show, we have to demonstrate where this wealth has come from. And I think that's something definitely, at least from the politically exposed persons or people that I'm looking at in the book, I think that's something that we're starting to see more. So in the UK, quite recently, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Azjaban? Yes. Yes, so they've said to her now, so her husband was a former bank manager in their state, developing country. And one of the interesting things that, really spoke to me. Yes. The Supreme Court have now said to her that she has to actually tell them where her wealth has actually come from. This is somebody who walked into Harrods and spent 16 million pounds. I mean, I wish I had 16 million pounds, as one does, as one does. So I think there's definitely now a shift. It wasn't as easy in previous years, so I think there's more spotlight being shone on them. And I don't know if you want to add anything onto that.
I also think that the relationship between lawyers and their clients is different from financial institutions and their clients inherently. And therefore, whereas financial institutions, the relationship can be automated, and they pay a lot in insurance, so they can afford the fines on the one end. If you hear on the news that HSBC was fined £65 million for money laundering of and NatWest as well. So they can take the hit. When you're talking about a law firm, they may not be able to withstand a fine, and therefore they're quite averse to reporting, and the exposure has more consequences than an institution like a bank. And so there's this tension of the, as she said, client privilege being sacrosanct, as opposed to a financial institution who can afford to take on drug dealers as clients. Yeah, so that was just my addition.
You're willing to pay the fees. We're happy to be your banker, sort of thing. But lawyers perhaps don't have that privilege to do so.
Yeah.
If I may ask, you spoke about the enablers in very general terms, then you alluded to the legal profession. Do you think there's a specificity here? Is it something that self-regulation within the profession can, to some extent, address, or do you think a hard regulatory framework will ultimately be more important?
Well, I feel like I said, the legal profession is one profession that virtually cuts across all professions. And to me personally, I feel they should be held more accountable, because, like I said, behind the veil of criminality are enablers, and most of the enablers are legal practitioners. But because they know they have that client's lawyer privilege, whereby they can hide under that umbrella and do anything. But to be frank, that is not fair. They should be held more accountable. I think it's high time we forget about privilege. I feel that should be part of the reforms. If we're actually to head somewhere in regulatory illicit finance, we should start forgetting about legal privilege. We should open up a little bit to ensure that at least there's an end to money laundering. Thank you.
No, that I agree with that, because
Yes, disagreement.
Because I mean, the lawyers don't necessarily pick their clients, and when you want to go to your lawyer, same as like when you go to your doctor, you want to be confident that there's going to be that level of confidentiality, as it were. So I don't know if I agree with that, but that's just my personal view.
Maybe other professions, accountants who do
true.
tax planning, for instance.
Very creative.
My worry there is that when you look at what some of these monies are used for, when you look at the aftermath, the finance of terrorism, should a lawyer under the guise of client's privilege enable his clients to transport illicit finance for the for terrorist activities? No. So at times we have to look at the bigger picture. We have to look at how far does this go? Who does it affect?
These are ongoing debates in the profession, and therefore these disagreements are legitimate. Recently, we held a focus group with PR experts who work for perhaps clients that we might consider disreputable. And their concern was that if a certain set of players, through self-regulation, establishes very demanding criteria, we won't deal with these people, they would just be creating opportunities for either less scrupulous practitioners. And the point was about PR, but it applies to the legal profession as well. So that was the key argument used to say, no, we need a level playing field, because otherwise we're just, promoting the interests of the shadier operators in our field. But I'm going to pass on the word to Clara, who has another online question.
So we talked about bankers, lawyers and clients, but Adam online has asked, what would you say about law enforcement agencies being professional enablers in situations where they assist criminals to launder money?
I sort of think there's a couple of case studies in the mind of that question, but...
Well, I think I'll also use the Nigerian experience. I think sometime last year, the Super Cup, who enabled a particular celebrity to launder criminal proceeds. He was actually in the system. He was at the highest level of the police force, but he was actively involved in criminal activities. So it could be anyone. If we also look at it from the angle that most people who launder criminal process are in government. So there's this conflicting attitude, because here they are laundering these proceeds and at the same time sitting at the table as lawmakers. So they will definitely try to create loopholes either for themselves or for their accomplices. So it's actually a very difficult scenario in which we need more than the tick of boxes, but complete dedication. Thank you.
Please, you could also introduce yourself. If you can make it very brief, we only have 5 minutes left.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot through this discussion. My name is Julius. I'm doing the Masters of African Studies at the African Studies Center. My question goes back to the continent. So what happens, talking of the legal systems, where individuals are stronger than the systems? Let's say the head of state of country B is actually in control of everything, and his friend or people in his group does the corruption or the money laundering, and the system can't hold him accountable because he's connected to the person who is bigger than the system. So what are the measures in place to hold such people accountable? Thank you.
Thank you. And if we could just get the other question, and then we'll wrap it up then.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I am a master's student at the School of Global and Area Studies, and I'm also a researcher with the Research Society for International Law. We're a think tank based in Pakistan. And over the past 2 years, we've done a lot of work on the FATF recommendations, working with criminal justice sector actors. So my question is, the FATF's emphasis on self-regulation specifically with the DNFPPs, don't you think that undermines the concept of effective compliance in countries like Pakistan or in the global south? So for example, when we go to real estate agents in Pakistan, they say like the average person in Pakistan buys land only once in their life. Who is flipping real estate? the judges, the bureaucracy, the military. Now, when they report them, they're like, you're bringing the onus on us. Now, previously, before the pressure from the FATF, the Federal Board of Revenue had readily had access to all the data. Anytime someone purchases land, it's in the registry. But now, because of the pressure from the FATF, you've actually undermined, the FBR says, okay, no, we don't want to do it anymore. The real estate agents say, we can't do it because this brings so much risk upon us. And then now what we have going on now is like everyone's just ticking the boxes, submitting STRs, like 10 STRs a month, and then we're good. The FATF won't pressure us. So would you have any comments on that? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just, who wants to answer very briefly any of these questions? Well,
Question for you guys.
I think to the first question about, I guess, politically exposed persons yielding their power to subvert the course of justice, that is endemic globally. And what we as a network have been trying to do is train prosecutors on how to recover, how to identify, how to be aware of some of the crimes that are committed. But I think what's become clear is that there's no contextualization. So we know in certain countries in Africa, some of these charges are brought against political opponents. So they are trumped up charges about corruption, broadly based, bribery, fraud, what have you. So it's also a governance issue as well as a financial crime issue. Yeah. And of course they intersect. And these are what development is, well, loosely conceived, and what governance is. So there are also governance issues within Global South countries that we also need to deal with before financial crime regulation. And states are making a headway in doing this. We've implemented bribery regulation. We're trying to implement corruption legislation, and looking at how prosecutors, lawyers can tackle such cases and such incidences and submit evidence of such charges. So there are some movements. We're trying to move the needle somehow. It'll take years, I suppose. And I think there's some progress towards it. As for the second question, I think Lovina is equipped.
Well, first of all, most of these people, especially the ones in government, they have what we call immunity. And the immunity shields them from prosecution. But usually, after their tenure, they could be prosecuted. Yes. But we have been having a conversation of trying to remove this immunity. It may not be immediate, but I feel we will get there. Because we are like, you cannot wait till they leave office. Let them account for their actions once they are there. Because we know the salaries, it's open. So the properties they acquire, the things they have, is not justifiable. So let's prosecute them while in office. And I think we are getting there because there have been a lot of calls, there have been meetings, there have been deliberations on the need of removing political immunity. Thank you.
It's also, sorry, just to add on and to hand it back to you, there are also certain criteria before running for office that we're trying to implement, where you should be free of corruption charges. And I guess it's also two-pronged, because now corruption charges are being used to prevent nominees from running. But that is one aspect in which they try to prevent people who have inklings towards illicit finance and financial crime from getting into office and using that immunity to become billionaires.
Actually, in Nigeria, there was a breakthrough. The former head of the Supreme Court was removed from office.
Yes.
So normally he had pleaded immunity, but just like you said, lawyers can be innovative. They were actually innovative enough, and they were able to go around it, and he was dismissed from office. So we're actually getting there. It's just that it is not moving at the pace we would have loved it to move. But I feel that in terms of politically exposed person benefiting from criminal proceeds, very soon in the nearest future, it may be a thing of the past, because there has been so much of innovations. People have sat back, think of what should be done and how it can also affect the society.
I was just going to to add, based on to piggyback on what you said, I think this idea of trying to prosecute whilst they're in office can actually serve as an anti-corruption tool itself. So I definitely agree that that might be another way to move the position forward slightly.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our speakers for an excellent event. And thank you very much, Lucky Star. I'm very happy that we managed to have you contribute despite the hiccups. Thank you.